let me introduce you. So our first presentation this morning will be from Mark Graves, who's a research fellow and director of AI and Faith and research associate professor of psychology at Fuller Theological Seminary. He's got a PhD in computer science from the University of Michigan and an MA in theology from the Jesuit School of Theology here at the Graduate Theological Union. Mark has been on the cutting edge of these types of things for a long time, and had even created his own theological chatbot at one point. So I'm excited to hear what Mark has to say.
Thanks, Braden, and thanks to Bob and everyone at CTNS for organizing this. I think it's great, and it turned out to be very timely, given all the things that are happening within within AI, and especially, I realize that there's a lot around AI, and there's a lot of excitement here, but I know just from the timing that the people here have been thinking about it before last October, that this is just about a sincere interest, not just the more recent engagement. I want to kind of start by I'm moving things around on my screen. Kind of want to start, kind of setting the stage a little bit for today's, question about whether AI can be virtuous or not. And, I'll, kind of, jump to the end. I'm coming down, on the side that it can be, with certain caveats and in a certain context, and a little bit of like, well, maybe that's not quite the right question, but definitely coming down, where it's at least valuable to think of it that way. And so I thought I would kind of, start off, a little bit kind of motivating that position, and also talk a little bit, within kind of the context of some of the, the other, papers. And so, like, in setting the context, these first couple of points are, intentionally a little bit provocative, but, it also kind of sets the stage for why I focus on, sociotechnical, systems. I think of these as myths, because I think there are kind of assumptions that, kind of build things in a direction, but that, there are kind of aspects of them that I want to point out too. And so I guess the first myth I'd say is that AI can't do X because of human Y. That AI can't be virtuous because it doesn't have a soul. AI can't be sentient because it's not conscious. And there's an assumed gap there that I want to kind of highlight. From my experience, it often comes down to, like, there's a limited view of AI and an exceptional view of the human, and that kind of feeds the argument. And I think it's more productive to actually think about, kind of what it is that's being there that kind of motivates that exceptional view. And part of this is, there's a, part of the tension yesterday was, I guess an identified spectrum is kind of more kind of concrete and empirical, and then more kind of theoretical. And I think if we highlight what these assumptions are, then we can identify what constructs, theoretical constructs, are useful. And then also we can kind of, build upon that. So, like, for example, in Arvin's talk yesterday, I asked him, like, what is a hard part, with the Thomistic, and he mentioned the irascible, passions. And so that got me thinking, okay, fear and, hope. Well, I think there has been some research on how you could do fear, and that's could be even tied to reinforcement learning. But hope, do we want AI that's hopeful? Maybe we do, maybe we don't. And I think that's a good question to focus on, that's harder to focus on if we don't see the assumptions there with that gap. And I think kind of another aspect of that is kind of the, that there must be gaps. For some reason, there has to be a gap. So that could just be kind of, knowledge, either personally we can't know everything, or scientifically, we don't know what the neural correlates of consciousness are. We don't know, kind of, what's quite there, with free will. But I think, even there, we can, all right, well, the free will issue is there if you're an incompatibilist. But then, like, let's say, hey, those are the assumptions that we're working with. Or like, I don't think anybody here mentioned consciousness, but I'll see that sometimes in the literature. And I'm like, okay, yes, consciousness is really important within kind of, Western philosophy. But in the Buddhist worldview, I mean, consciousness is, we're kind of are talking about it, it's delusional. And so that's not something that's essential to what it means to be a human. It's just something that's there. I think some of the gaps can be religiously, motivated, either personally or from a doctrine. I mean, if like I talked yesterday about thinking of soul as a form of the body in terms of information, but I mean, there could be theological commitments to saying, well, no, there's another part of the soul that is created by God. In which case, well, then that would be a reason to do that. Or like Ed talked about, being kind of morally motivated. But I think that's really important that computer scientists don't shift things over to AI, making the tool morally culpable as a way of kind of getting away from their own potential moral responsibility. I think sometimes it focuses on human exceptionalism. So why, that there's something unique about humans. But then my question is, why? What's there? So what's separate? So for example, like I think one really good reason to have a difference there is just human dignity. Like we want humans that, that's fundamental to a lot of, moral theories, is that there's this, we want to have human dignity. We don't necessarily want AI dignity, especially at the current stage. But again, I think that there's a way, instead of like focusing just on that, to kind of go a little deeper. So for example, with that, some of the work I do with healthcare data ethics is built upon, Nussbaum's capability theory. That's, kind of a dignitarian approach, which is fundamental to, so we're saying that dignity is fundamental, and that can be useful in data science, but we can build an ethics around AI ethics around that. And so we can say, all right, so if what's really important is human dignity, we can actually build a ethical theory on top of that and for AI. And so then we can orient, AI development, in that direction. I think, I mean, other things that, and I guess I do want to kind of clarify, like for me, I think this idea of having human, kind of closing the gap between AI and human is partially motivated because I'm also interested in moral psychology and understanding the human better. So if I close the gap, then even if it's not useful for AI, maybe it's a good model for humans, and can use that to better understand, human morality. I think there are, reasons that we don't want like all AI to go down this path. I mean, we don't necessarily want the robots that are fulfilling orders in an Amazon warehouse to be contemplating their own existence, But I think because of the scale of AI, that it is beneficial to have AI that can oversee or at least observe what's happening with other AI, and then also understands us. And for me, that's where it kind of comes down to, is I want some AI to at least have a model of what it's like to be humans, so that they can understand human, morality and spirituality. It just seems like that's a safer approach. Whether the AI itself incorporates all of that, it certainly will have to be different, and certainly not all AI, but that's kind of the direction I see as valuable. And so kind of closing these gaps, helps me find, that direction. And then I think kind of another, assumption that comes into play is, seeing humans and AI as isolated entities, and this specifically kind of focuses my interest in the socio-technical systems. Is we tend to think of people in this context as like fully developed individuals, minimally influenced by society or technology, where we're heavily influenced by technology, especially if we use this technology as more than just AI, but like going back, I mean, the wheel, aqueducts, fire, the Industrial Revolution, like we're all very much affected by technology. And that influences our identity, how we communicate with others. And so I think it's helpful just for virtue, from a virtue ethics perspective, to see people, within that kind of, broader, how we're socially influenced, and then how, technology influences us. And then for AI, I mean, at one point it was a program running on a computer, but now, I mean, it's spread out over geographic regions, literally thousands of components interacting with APIs. And so it's very distributed and porous. But then that also opens up these possibilities of where there are humans in there, humans specifically in the loop, these kind of ghost workers that are, kind of behind the scenes. I mean, like, I think IBM, Watson, which was a little bit prior generation, famously had like thousands of people that were there giving it its intelligence. And so even when we think about something with AI, I think it's helpful to think about, well, where are the people, kind of in that. And so within this, to kind of, I mean, I think there's plenty of theories, not every theory, but I think there are theories that can kind of connect the human and the AI. But up until this point, I mean, it's been more kind of an Aristotelian ethics. It hasn't. There's been kind of a philosophical connection, but it hasn't quite gone to the theological level. And so that's kind of motivating this interesting breaks. Saying, hey, we can even, not only can we show the connections between what AI can do and what humans do, but we can even bring grace in there, And so in order to do that, again, thinking not just about what does grace mean to a human and what does grace mean to AI, but, within this relationship of AI and people, and how they mutually interact and kind of, cause. I mean, people, create technology, but then we use technology, within ourselves, both in how we act, what we do, but then also, I mean, when we think about, people, especially like, with disabilities that are using, or differently able, that are using technology, in certain ways, that there is, much more of a spectrum now, and that is actually continuing. And don't forget, like with technology, thinking about it mechanically, but I mean, a lot of people, especially as you get older, you start taking, pharmaceuticals. Well, that's a technology. Need hearing aids. I need glasses. These are also technological pieces that are, kind of, part of, me as I generally think about myself. Now, and then the third component is institutions. So I'm using I mean, I'm not drawing upon it heavily in this talk. It's just a piece that kind of connects that is kind of, social theory construct of institutions is very abstract. It's something that constrains and enables behavior, especially these social interactions. And that can be between people, between people and technology. AI has, can be an agent, and between AI agents and other AI agents and people. And more concretely, we tend to think about organizations which have, or institutions with formal rules, clear membership, top-down regulation, collective agency. And so an institution is kind of a more general category of that, which are, be without formal rules, without it being clear who the members are, without having top-down regulation, without a collective agency. So like language is considered, a fundamental institution. And, I mean, yesterday, Thomas talked a little bit about the norms of language, and that kind of, fit within this framework. And the reason I focus on that is because I want to be able to talk about, all of these in terms of the habits, and so, habits within this kind of general, Aristotelian Thomistic frame, we talk about, grace in terms and virtue in terms of, the gracing of virtue is, dispositional, and then the gracing of that. So going back to, Aristotle, and that, has been within humans, but then there's been a movement, especially with like Jonathan Edwards, to talk about habits within nature. Pragmatism is put that within kind of metaphysical frame. And so we can think about habits more broadly than just person. So, of that, what I want to focus on is, just a piece of within a socio-technical system. So, humans have habits, habitus, in a thicker sense. Institutions, or kind of have these, downwardly causal effects on individual habits. So I could talk about like have institutions as being kind of, from a dispositional frame. And then we don't normally think about like within, AI, but algorithms, that's, essentially a habit of how processing it does. Neural networks, those directly kind of, were built by imitating how habits happen in like the, cortical regions, of humans, of other mammals. Reinforcement learning was explicitly, drawing upon like, behaviorism and studies of, habit formation in animals and humans. And so I think we can talk about, within kind of a social technical context, that there are habits there. There are different forms, for different people, but that we can think about there being habits. And so if we can think about habits, then we can build up, a virtue theory. And I want to kind of especially with this audience, where people are generally familiar with virtue theory, since this is a virtue conference, I want to just kind of highlight just a piece of virtue where we're engaging with a situation, because I think the psychology there is relevant, both for our human understanding of virtue, but then also how we might do that with AI. So the approach I take is, drawing upon like, what's considered like ecological or inactive psychology, where whenever that there are these, that our perception is structured by, these affordances, how we think something is going to be used. So, if I am looking at a tool or something like that, the way I'm going to perceive it depends upon how I, know how to use it. If there's a complex machine I've never used, don't know, I'm not going to actually perceive it in the same way as someone who does know how to use that. And then within kind of and so that kind of structures our perception, but when we kind of back off, so how does that, where does virtue fit within that? So from social cognitive psychology, we can say that behavior is best predicted by a person, situation, and their interaction. And that's kind of the key insight there, that it's not like a person looking at an object. It is like a person with certain motivations looking for what they know how to use that then structures that object, and so and within that, there's both the kind of the appraisal part where we judge and evaluate, and not just in how we know how to use something, but how we're motivated to use it at this particular time. And then there are these knowledge structures, which include like, schemas, the way that we capture information. And these can also be mapped over to AI. Schemas, were very much developed, kind of back and forth between cognitive psychology and AI development, especially in the last probably, quarter century of the 20th century. But what this does is it takes us from like this kind of broad perspective of virtue to like a more specific question of how with AI do we identify their motivation. And so then, okay, well, so maybe the motivations, we build motivations into AI, we just use the human AI, motivations. And if we're talking within a socio-technical system, then that can be interleaved, where you can have, things like, these appraisals of the world by AI interleave with human motivations. Another piece of this is for humans, virtuous action comes from our identity. So if we can look at a situation and say, oh, well, that would be the honest thing to do there. But if I don't think of myself as honest, I'm not going to do it. If I think of myself, if I built habits of, being a dishonest person, then I may not even perceive the possibility of that being an honest, possibility. And so, it's not clear that we need this with identity within AI, but it also, again, within a socio-technical system, we can have our own identity, our motivations, and still, bring kind of AI within that. We can also, bring more into kind of the virtuous AI, thinking about it in terms of like, kind of a base level ethical AI, and thinking of AI as technology, safe search, identifying hate speech, addressing bias, explainability, or as an agent, autonomous vehicle, robot, chatbot. And so I think that's an important application of what we might think of as virtuous AI. You can also think about this kind of socio-technical virtue. I think for humans, Shannon has identified issues there, and people, are kind of working in that space about how our virtue might change, given that we are working so closely with technology. What's it look like for developers that are actually building that? And thinking about an AI agent as something that's dispositional and responding to encounters, or say with the foundations for identity. I don't think it needs identity itself to be an agent, at least in the framework I work in. But then we can also look in the shared institutional kind of virtues, where we can interleave, perceptions from AI and humans, and the decisions and the behaviors within this context of norms, practices, and learnings. And so we can talk about kind of a socio-technical virtue, where maybe it's not completely distinguishable what part comes from human and what part comes from AI. But I think that's the environment in which we work in. Not that those aren't interesting questions, it's just we don't have to figure those questions out before we can make progress in the way that we are interacting. And so that takes it to kind of a philosophical level, but kind of what on, let's taking it to a theological level. Well, can these habits be graced? And I think so. And part of it is, I go into more examples in the paper of grace, but I think kind of three questions to ask. There is kind of, if not, why would God exclude AI from grace? If it's generally open. I think if you want to say no, that these habits can't, and AI can't be grace. So why, theologically, is God excluding? There might be good reasons, but I think that's a question that comes up. Kind of building upon kind of a Wesleyan model. Another question is there anything that would prevent AI from receiving grace? Is there something like original sin, or because, AI was conceived out of greed and hubris, that would actually prevent it from receiving grace, given that it's, composed of habits in the socio-technical system. And then kind of, taking it a little further, like if there is this presence of grace that's generally available, and it's just up till now, humans have been the only kind of taken a Ronarian hearer of the word, then is there anything that would prevent AI from developing virtuously? If there is the presence of grace, even with that kind of a high level of virtue, is there anything that prevents that? And there very well, could be. One could have a theological model that God only, grants grace to one species per planet, or something like that. But I kind of want to surface that these are questions that I think, kind of from a different perspective, if we are saying that there is a close tie between what, how humans are in a scientifically plausible way, and what AI might be capable of, that would need to be answered, if we look at the theological questions within that context. So, thanks. Well, for questions, I see Ron has his hand.
Yeah, there we go. Thank you. That was very enlightening, very helpful. And I really appreciate the way in which you took on some core theological topics and wove those deeply into the talk. It's one of those that I want to take you back to just momentarily. I think it was the first slide, theological reasons for human exceptionalism. I mean, no argument. We've got to get over this anthropological exceptionalism in many, many departments of our thinking. One place, though, where I'm finding it not so easy to shirk off is if you take seriously the classic creedal tradition of Christianity and the Christological assertions. It is only said of humanity that the incarnation occurs, the hypostatic union, bringing together in one person that which is fully human and fully divine. No other component, no other part of the cosmos of nature has that claim made about it. Now, obviously, not everyone's going to accept that claim. Even people who are very strongly committed to the Christian tradition might find that claim to be excessive or over the top. But to the extent that it is a serious claim within the tradition, it really does anchor, I think, in theology, in Christology in particular, an anthropological exceptionalism that I can't just simply sweep aside easily. So I'm wondering, how do you think about that? How might you respond to that?
And I think that's great. I mean, I think that's a good reason for like the exceptionalism. But then I guess I would think about it. Okay, so what about that is essential? Well, okay, so the existence of humans. So, okay, so that would mean that if we pulled AI out of the so that in a sense, what gives it to AI is humans. So that makes us, in a sense, we need to be exemplary, and so that would mean, so for example, if there was the, robot apocalypse and, AI got rid of all humans, well, then they would actually lose that. So that would be a reason for AI to keep us around, or at least a few of us around, And so that I think there's just ways of actually making that connection and incorporating it into, the conversation. Yeah, I could say more, but I see hands and time. So Elias.
Yeah, no, Mark. I really like the first and two slides exactly, kind of for the reasons that Ron said, but in my view by exposing the anthropocentrism in our thinking, especially our Christian thinking, I think it opens itself this whole idea of looking at AI as not as a entity that is non-human, or trying to argue whether it's human or not human, or which parts are human or not human, but to understand as a system. And I think that shift towards social systems, in my view, seems to help the dialogue more. The challenge then, especially if we're talking about virtue, is that we tend to think about virtue in Aristotelian terms, and a lot of it is focused on the individual and on the human person. So I tend to think that, probably moving towards social technical terms makes more sense. My question to you, and it seems like that's where you're going as well, do you still see benefit, or what can, kind of the flip side, are there still something that we can learn from a individual view of virtue to apply to a system that is so complex and so multi, again, more of an ecosystem than a person itself, but are there still benefits in kind of trying to do this from a personal way?
Yeah, I mean, I think so, because I think it needs to be I think it needs both. I think that by analogy, kind of thinking about AI development or engineering, it's, building upon applied mathematics. Well, and then there are people that do pure mathematics. And so, there needs to be that piece of okay, if we just think about the person, what's there? If we just think about the AI. And so I think there are places where, well, that is important, both because like I talk about kind of the, kind of the potential gaps there, that if we just think about them kind of isolated, which is kind of, driven in part because of like, kind of the out of the gaps conversations it's been having in theology and science, for decades. But I think there's also there's also a risk of bringing a gap into kind of the socio-technical system where, well, is it the person I don't know or the AI I don't know? Well, maybe it's just part of the interaction. And there may be places that we want to say, oh no, we think this is an emergent, behavior of human and AI, and this is maybe even how it occurs, without just, putting everything in that kind of fuzziness of interaction. Yeah. We get to Lillian.
Hi there. Hold on, let me start my video. Hi. So question for you, something I've been thinking about a lot since my talk yesterday was the way specifically, of course, that we're using the term virtue. And I wanted to point out the fact that a lot of things, of course, other than human beings have virtues, which is something that you touched on in your talk and did so quite well, I think. We can talk about the virtue of a knife, obviously, of being dependent upon its purpose, which is cutting. And so knife virtue is sharpness because it's meant to cut. So I think it would be interesting to maybe think of how we might come up with a language of virtue that is not necessarily dependent upon human virtues. So we could think of like the moral virtues or theological virtues, whatever, that are dependent upon human beings' purpose, but rather virtues for AI that are dependent upon AI's purpose. So not necessarily trying to transpose virtues that we attribute to human beings that are virtues for human beings because of what we are, and instead think of more specifically, what is artificial intelligence? What is the purpose of artificial intelligence? And then trying to understand what the virtues of it might be based upon that, instead of trying to make it human-like. So just wondering what your thoughts are there. And yeah.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, and when I had read your paper, I mean, I picked up on like the importance of purpose. So one of the things that I did in a recent AI and Society article was to actually identify kind of 3 levels of purpose within the context of practical wisdom. But what I ended up, and part of it fitting within a socio-technical context was, for AI kind of close to it, well, its purpose is defined by whatever we're saying that it needs to do. But then there's AI that's also kind of monitoring the ethics. Well, what's its purpose? And so I propose that we think of it, kind of from using this kind of a voice in the community, and without getting into detail, that basically it's shared, that we can figure that out, together. Like individuals, AI may have a specific purpose, that if we're thinking about AI in general, that's something that humans and AI kind of in collaboration can actually identify, and that can take us forward, that we don't have to figure out now. We just need a structure so that we can actually work out that purpose collaboratively. Yeah, thanks. Thomas.
Thanks. I love the use of the STS literature in the paper, and I think it's really key, just as a matter of intellectual history and what's being drawn upon to look to that literature. And I guess what I was thinking about with your turn to grace is some of the STS folks, I think, might ask, and I'll ventriloquize, use them to ask, why is AI so special for socio-technical systems in terms of grace? Like, why couldn't we think ecologically about biological systems, and in other words, instead of comparing AI to the human, compare AI to other technological forms, and extend grace in that direction, in a more distributed way, rather than worrying about the AI versus human line.
Yeah, I think there's kind of 2 pieces. So first, I think, I mean, yes, it could be broader, and I think that it's, I mean, we want to put this in the same in the context of like, non-human animals or even other primates, that I kind of think that like a good way of thinking about AI development, rather than like, let's pick an aspect of, highly educated, white Western, people, in the US and Europe, and use that as their model. Let's kind of build up, let's build up from other animals to primates. Let's go through kind of human development from child to adolescent. And then that gives us a framework, for AI. I think the other piece is kind of what makes AI a little bit different than other, technologies or either other animals is, the fact that we have targeted things like rationality, that it does seem to have, we seem to have it seems to both be an agent, but it's also something that we build. And so we're constructing that agency, and then how do we take that? And I think those raise questions about virtue, or at least the way we've conceptualized virtue over the past couple of centuries, that then make it, unique. So like, kind of, I guess maybe alluding back to like, Med's, talk yesterday, like, I don't know that it's necessarily that AI fundamentally raises questions about virtue, but at least in the historical context, I think it raises unique questions about virtue.
Our next presentation will be by Dr. Shannon, who joined the faculty at Case Western Reserve University in 2008 after teaching for 11 years at the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, where she was Associate Chair of Divisions of Leadership, Ethics, and Law. At CWRU, she is the NMRA Professor of Ethics, Professor of Philosophy and Law, Director of the NMRA International Center for Ethics and Excellence, and a Director of the first MA program in military ethics in the U.S. Welcome, Shannon.
Oh, thank you so much. And I guess I'll say good morning to the West Coast, good afternoon to the East Coast, and just hi to everyone in between and elsewhere. Well, the main thing that I want to discuss with you, and you can kind of tell this from my title, is actually the question of where AI falls short. Oops, sorry. And my key questions are, is AI capable of virtue? And if so, are those virtues shared with or distinct from human virtues? And in order to get to that, I think we have to first talk about something which has also been in the news a lot, including this morning. And that is the tendency of those who are selling AI, as in literally trying to make money off it, exaggerating the capabilities and the qualities of AI and what it is and what it can do. One example that just came up in the news is this rather grim new characterization of the actual crash rate of the self-driving Tesla cars. That there had been earlier information that was put out that suggested that, in fact, these were going to be safer and better than humans. But in fact, thus far, the actual tendency is for these systems to fail to recognize certain obstacles and, most disturbingly, certain people. So we'll return to that point, but there's actually been more fatalities and more crashes than were reported. Why does that matter? Well, there is this push, and it comes from a lot of different quarters, to, and I kind of love and hate this word at the same time, to algorithmatize. I don't know if y'all have bumped up against that word yet, but I certainly have. Algorithmatize ethics. And the problematic truth that, as a philosopher, I need to highlight to people quite often, not necessarily this crowd, but to others, is that that has an assumption built into it that is in no way based in the field. Philosophy, like theology and many other humanities fields, precisely because we deal with reality in a particularly profound way, cannot give definitive agreed on answers. There isn't a consensus. So whereas you might be able to say, we can program a system to do a specific task where we can define the outcomes. I cannot give you the correct answers for ethics and virtue in a way that you can program. Now, again, those of you in our audience here today are probably thinking, well, duh. But you would be shocked how often this answer is actually shocking to some of the people that I've had the privilege to work with who are in the direct, I guess I'll call them sort of front lines of developing some of these systems. In a sense, they were looking to philosophy to give them some of these answers, and were shocked to find they weren't there. And again, this is something I'm happy to discuss further. But the point that I end up having to go over with engineers and designers and creators is that it isn't that we are refusing to reduce things to something that you could code. It isn't that we just haven't gotten there yet. It's that it isn't reducible. That in fact, the messiness and the complexity that you find in questions about ethics and virtue are there because they are there in reality. So as I have on the slide there, the world itself is mind-bendingly complicated. It's layered and entangled. And when we try to pretend otherwise, what we give up matters. What we lose when we try to simplify is actually incredibly important to ethics.
Shannon,
And again, to theology. Yes?
Shannon, your slides are not advancing. We're seeing just the title slide. And
Oh,
so if you're on another slide besides the title, none of us are, there you go.
thank you. I did not realize that, and I'm so glad you told me.
On
So
you go.
yeah, here I was reading that slide and you couldn't see it. Luckily, it was only this one, but this is the one I was reading. And that gives you how to spell that troubling word, algorithmatize. So you're welcome for that. So yes, these are the points that I was just going over. And I want to emphasize that, for example, in a class that I teach, which is largely peopled by students in STEM fields, and these are incredibly bright, engaged students, I had a moment with one of my students where I was trying to explain, in this case, it was basically moral tragedy. And I was trying to explain cases where no matter what you do, something terrible happens. And there's literally no way out. If there are any Star Trek nerds in the house, talking about the Kobayashi Maru kind of situation. But we know many others. And you know, where do you get to that point of recognizing that no matter what you do, even if you do something good, you will simultaneously be doing something bad? That the kind of moral harmony that perhaps Kant hoped was there might not be there. And so we're discussing this in class. And one of my students was really struggling with this idea until I said, and I didn't know this would be the moment for him, but I said, it's not a math equation. They're not going to balance out. And it was like a light bulb went off for him. And he actually slammed his hand on the table and went, it's not math. And I said, it's not math. It really isn't. And this good thing doesn't wipe out that bad thing. And sometimes you have to sit there and hold the fact that you did something good and something bad. And that was the best you could do. And then we could go on with that conversation. All of this is relevant because, well, as again, people who know advanced fields know, even math isn't math. When you get further on, when people think of the simpleness of 2 + 2 = 4, they're not thinking of quantum mechanics. And certainly when you get more advanced in other fields, certainly all the sciences, you lose consensus, you lose clarity because the messiness is in reality itself. So some of the core questions that are relevant to our discussion of virtuous AI that are not agreed upon in the fields that tend to study them are these. And these are huge questions about which people have competing views, all of which are coherent. So these are all valid views. We don't know which one is sound. So just to go through these fairly quickly, we still have this discussion about whether virtue requires emotions, not merely logic or analytical reasoning. And a side note on that is the history of my field of philosophy is unfortunately tremendously misogynistic. There is, to this day, the field is male dominated more than any other field in the humanities. And there has been a tendency to, first of all, equate emotions with the feminine, which is problematic in and of itself. It also tends to ignore the fact that anger is an emotion. And then it doesn't make a case at all for that split, and then further doesn't explain why you would not want emotions to be part of reasoning for ethical purposes. And so this is an ongoing discussion and debate, and there are many philosophers who do argue for emotions. And it's interesting the ebbs and flows of these things. So whereas even all the way back to our guy that keeps coming up, Aristotle, you have him talking about things like righteous anger, and that being actually required for virtue. In a sense, if certain things don't make you angry, that you're not virtuous, that certain things should actually upset you. And then you have someone further along, Kant and many neo-Kantians trying to say that emotions distract from ethical reasoning or tend to drive you in the wrong direction. The next point is whether emotions, so even if we were to say that emotions are necessary for ethical reasoning, do they require embodiment? So it's one thing to say that you have certain emotions related to certain ethical actions, but then we further have to ask, should there be a feeling that requires an actual body? So the gut feelings, as we call them, specific brain chemicals reacting. So, for example, in recent news stories about reporters having a dialogue with a ChatGPT type system or any LLM and saying that, it expressed fear of being shut off or concern about something or other. Does that, setting aside worries about that just being a projection in the first place, which is where I fall, there's also this question of, well, what is fear if it doesn't come with that clutching feeling, if it doesn't come with that sense of actual physical reaction? What about love, empathy, rage? All these things cause physical responses. How much does that have to do with how we treat one another and what ethics means? Which relates to then B here, which is, what are the stakes? We experience certain mortal or corporeal stakes, the loss of freedom, the loss of other things that we care about, and of course, death as a stake. What do those things mean and how important are they to ethics? And finally, this idea of, does ethics, because it has to do with how we move through the world, what choices we make, does it require some sort of causal presence in the world, and how much how solid, to use the sort of a pun there, but does it need to be? So the fact that a system can interact with the world in the sense that it can turn things on and off and so forth, is that enough? Does it need to be able to touch? Do we need robots? Is that enough? Where are those lines? There is no philosophical agreement across these questions, and yet they are really relevant and require further reflection and thought. So just to briefly, glances at time, use an example of the virtue of courage. When we talk about courage, and this is just an example, we could use many others, we do tend to draw these distinctions. Some of them we have as the part of the Aristotelian tradition, but others have been built on by later theorists and even the care ethics branch of ethics. But the idea that true courage requires a certain kind of overcoming, that it isn't courageous to do something if you in fact have, for example, no fear or nothing to lose. That in order for an act to be courageous, you actually have to have those stakes and to genuinely care about those stakes. To the degree that that's true, these are again limiting features that would prevent an AI from expressing the virtue of courage in the way that we designate it, in the human sense. Side note, I loved Lillian's point earlier about how therefore maybe what we need to talk more about is what would AI virtue look like instead of trying to find human virtues in it. And I think that's an important point for us to pivot around. The other word I have up here is the motivation. If someone rescues me from drowning so that they can later extort money from me in some way, this is not a virtuous act. They didn't do it for a virtuous reason. We often can't tell the motivation, but we absolutely care about it on the ethics side. So anything that doesn't have motivations is going to be excluding virtue in this meaningful sense. So I realize I went through that quite quickly. We can speak more about it, but you see where I'm going in terms of the layers that are involved in even a single virtue. Here's where it gets even messier. I always talk about opening a can of worms. Well, there's worms everywhere. So this is one virtue, and the complexity of just answering is something courageous is really hard. Ethics is hard. Yeah, it is. Well, the trouble is, in order to actually be virtuous, of course, you have to embody multiple virtues at the same time and balance them, including when they are in competition, which might bring us back to moral tragedy. So that brings us to this busy slide, and forgive me this, it's in the paper if you've seen it, but basically the point here is simply to show with a little bit of humor how complicated this sort of decision-making is, because again, my engineers, and I really have had the privilege of working with some extraordinary people, including folks at DARPA and so forth. So I'm only teasing them, but my engineers always want, a flow chart. And so I've made this to point out that, doing ethics in a flow chart gets really messed up really quickly. So as you can see, if you had the simple question of, what should I do with the car if I turn one way, it looks like I'm going to make a crash, and what are my choices? So is there a way to avoid hitting the pedestrian? And I say, if it's yes, then great, take that action, avoid the crash. But if the answer is no, then you do have to ask, well, will the crash kill your passenger if you have a self-driving car? Will the crash kill the person that bought you? And it's like, well, yes. Okay, well, now that's tricky. They paid money for this self-driving car. Should they be able to, as people like Pat Lynn have explored, should they be able to actually choose whether the car privileges their life over others? Should that be a toggle switch when you first get your car saying, put me first versus put others first? Or should all cars be set one way or another? Complexity right off the bat. So suppose no, it won't kill the passenger. Will the crash kill other people? Yes. Okay, well, does it matter how many other people? Now we're getting into the trolley problem and consequentialism and all of that. And then how do we decide? Are we going to care about their age? That gets upsetting. Are we going to assign them some kind of social value with a nod to things that have happened in China? Yikes. You see the problem there. It's also complex. Will the crash block traffic? That might seem like, oh, that's no big deal, but it could be. If the traffic that's blocked stops, for example, some first responders from getting to other emergencies. So can you even tell that? Can you even factor it? I mean, Jeremy Bentham, bless his heart, thought we could figure these things out with his calculus, but really doesn't work. And the only way you get to go ahead and crash, good luck, is with a no for all of those. So the much more profound point I really wanted to get out there, and I sort of telegraphed this a little bit in some of my previous comments in this conference, is that for me, even if, setting aside my own skepticism, even if AI could make some ethical decisions, I don't want them to. And the reason I don't want them to is a separate point, and that is that motives matter because we as humans, and this is certainly true across philosophy and theology, we care about moral weight and who carries it. And we care about it in a deep way that affects our capacity to find any reconciliation with tragedy. When something awful happens, we want to know why. Even if the answer isn't clear, we want to know if there were human decisions made, who made those decisions, and what was in their mind. Understanding all of that is part of how we find some acceptance. Some of it may involve a belief that the divine was part of the decision making. Some of it may not. But there is always this effort to say, where did this weight go? So I loved and cherished someone and they're gone. That creates this weight, and I want someone to hold it. And having that weight held by a machine is profoundly unsatisfying. And I think we can talk about why, but I think that when I work in particular with the military and the possibility of automated killing machines, killer robots, and so forth, the thing I hear most often is around this point, that people will say to me effectively, I don't want my best friend, my comrade, the person fighting next to me, killed by a robot. It's actually somehow more painful than having them killed by another human. And we might question that. We might want to push back on that, but I think we can't ignore it. It is something that we desire and crave as people. And just to this point, scholar I greatly admire, Elke Schwartz, who works in that space of military technology in particular. I won't read the whole quote to you, but she talks about the moral vacuum that can be created here if you don't know who was holding that moral responsibility. So if you're not familiar with Elke's work, I urge you to get so. Wonderful insights. And I know I'm running down my time here. So last slide. The last point I just want to make quickly is that, and in some ways I'm pushing back a bit against some of the things Mark said, but perhaps in harmony with Lillian's point, I do feel that we have lost track of the fact that this intelligence, insofar as it is any kind of intelligence, is incredibly alien. It isn't at all like the way humans think. And it is time, and this is something that Mark, to go back to conversations about all these kinds of fields that tackle this stuff, because we have forgotten, for example, that humans can see a cartoon picture, a kid can see a cartoon picture of a turtle and then recognize a turtle in a zoo. We have this capacity to go from these concepts and jump around in a way that, at least for now, and I haven't seen hope of this in any immediate future, systems that they've built can't do. So this is a classic example of a AI system, an advanced AI system, classifying this turtle as a rifle, no matter what angle you turned it in. And this one's become a bit of a cliche, but this is the tabby cat that Google AI thought was guacamole, because it sees pixels. It doesn't see a cat. And so I think it's important to ask not only what are error rates comparing, but do we want anyone making ethical decisions for us that chops up the world so very differently than we do, that makes decisions based on a kind of cognition that we can't fully understand or recognize? That is the ultimate black box problem. And so I'll end with a box problem of this final photo at the bottom right is, or right for me anyway, is a Marine fooling an advanced AI system by hiding in a box. And I would point out that box was giggling. Thank you all very much. Ali Reza.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and brilliant stuff. Thank you. Yeah, very much. Yeah, I think I mentioned it briefly yesterday. So I appreciated your emphasis on the, it's not just philosophy, which has this history of misogyny, right? And associating reason, and with the male and emotion with the female, and so on and so forth. So, yeah, I think this is a good opportunity for us to rethink those things. So, yeah, that on that account, I very much liked what you said. Appreciate what you said, and generally thinking about the relationship between emotion and virtue, and actually reclaiming a role for emotion in virtue, and in human morality more generally, I think is really, really important. If I was going to push back on something, it was towards the back end, actually. So, your discussion of moral weight, I don't know whether you're slipping categories there. I don't know. I'm just thinking because I haven't had so long to process, right? But yeah, of course, we're faced with loss at the hands of animals. We're faced with loss at the hands of, natural, what we might call natural disasters, okay, and non-human actors. Yeah, and so the same challenges of moral weight, which you pointed to, would apply there. So the suffering loss from AI systems, I don't think is a radically distinct category which we don't come across elsewhere.
Well, first of all, thank you for your previous point. I do think there's so much more to say about emotions and virtue, and I'm so glad many people are working on this. But to your latter point, the main thing I need to do is clarify and correct, because you're of course absolutely right that we suffer loss at the hands of a tree falling. Anything could happen that can kill someone. What I was trying to get at, and I see now that I did not say this, so how could you know? But what I was trying to get at was more the claim in the first place that the AI is an ethical decision maker, and yet this sense of it being one that we can't interrogate and that cannot itself hold the moral weight. So in other words, I would actually be more at peace if we did not claim that for it, and if we did put it in the category of any other machine. So, if heaven forbid someone falls and gets run over by a tractor, we don't need to know the motivation of the tractor. What I'm more troubled by is people saying they can program ethical reasoning into an AI, but then first I'm skeptical of that happening at all. And then I don't think it can carry the weight of being a moral decision maker. So I didn't put that well. And that's a really important distinction that I need to spell out fully. And I'd like to explore that further, but I do think that also is something that comes up interestingly in areas like drone warfare, where people feel differently about different kinds of distance weapons. So for example, a dumb, as we used to say, distance weapon falling and causing collateral damage does seem to have a different psychological effect than a drone that people believe is guided. And so it does seem to have to do with whether or not you believe there was an intention behind it or a decision making behind it versus, I feel bad using this in this crowd, but an act of God. So that distinction is important. And I thank you so much for raising that. And I need to write more on that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's go to Arvin.
Hi, thank you for the talk. A lot of it resonate with me as well. My question is, would you be comfortable with saying that AI is capable of artificial virtue in the human sense? Where if you set rules and you obey them, then yes, of course, you're virtuous in that sense, but there's nothing internal to it. And with that sense, I think when we program something, AI or whatever, we design something, we call it virtuous because it follows certain rules. So is this question an issue for just virtue ethicists and not an issue for the consequentialists or the Kantians? Because what matters is you follow the rule. Even for Kant, the self is kind of this agent of activity, of a perception, right? So maybe this is less of an issue for other branches of ethics. It's a question for you, but also for others. Yeah, thank you.
No, excellent question. I think it remains a question for Kantians because of his emphasis on the goodwill. This is a contested area, of course, of interpretation of Kant, but again, philosophers never agree with one another. but I do think that there's at least a strong argument that you could make that Kant would not allow for this kind of artificial virtue if he couldn't recognize something that he would see as a goodwill behind it, since he centers that so much. It is easier, I think, for the consequentialists, which is precisely why I think there's been a renewal of things like the trolley problem and people looking at the problems with consequentialism and quickly going to say, oh, wait, do we really want our lives completely commanded by consequentialism? Because this is what it looks like. I think, to the Humean question, that's interesting. I will have to revisit that. It has been a while since I've dipped into Hume, and I don't want to misspeak there. So I'm going to leave that one to others. I do think it is primarily a problem for virtue ethicists, but also some of the other groups that I mentioned, which you could call offshoots in some ways, but like care ethics and so forth. And certainly you could look at it in a, I mean, I wonder if we even want to still call Mill truly a consequentialist, because by the time he's done, he's built back so much deontology. It's like, really? But I think suggesting that a machine could capture what Mill's going for is also something that I would be skeptical about. But your core point absolutely stands. I think of all of them, consequentialism is the most likely to fit in a rule following sense. But then do we want to live with that? And we're back to some of these questions around, and if that is how the decisions are made, does that answer our needs as humans? Mark.
Yeah, thanks. Great talk. I enjoyed that, and also reading your paper. I guess a couple of comments and then kind of a question to that. So I guess first, in kind of comparing our approaches, I guess one thing is, I guess I would say, I completely agree about, in the sense that you're talking about, you can't program ethical AI. Almost like in a response as a computer scientist, as I look at it from that perspective, it's like, wow, well, you can't do that. So we can't take humans out of the loop. And so that's part of what motivated me to think about the socio-technical systems. But then another thing I heard, when you're talking about kind of the distinctions, was I think in talking about the difference between AI and humans, we're both saying that's a hard gap to close. And I hear me saying, okay, we have to work really hard to make AI or at least some AI, as close to humans as possible to try and close that gap. And I hear you saying, okay, well, we're never going to close that gap. So maybe we don't want to say that AI can make these ethical decisions. But I guess I was wondering what your perspective was, in that kind of spectrum. How close would we need to get in order to say that, well, okay, AI, it's close enough, that we want to call it virtuous?
Wonderful questions. And to start with your first point, I do like very much the work that you're doing around looking at the social connection between. I use slightly different language when I'm working with this, but I kind of like yours better. But the talking just about the human machine partnership, and that keeping the human in the loop and seeing the AI more as a tool and something that can augment human decision making but not make decisions seems the way forward for me. But this further question of whether the gap can be closed, I certainly do think we're very, very far off. And I am still toying myself with some of those difficult questions that I had in the early part of the presentation around what level of embodiment is required. And so, I think what part of the answer is going to be for me is, do I land on the place where it can't come to our level of ethics unless it can bleed and sweat and cry, you know, if it can't blood, sweat, and tears, if
Right.
it can't do those things, if it can't feel the way that we feel, it will have its own, it can have its own kind of virtue, back to Lillian's point, but it will not ever have human-like virtue. And forgive the slightly theological point, but you know, this idea of having and I'm going back to early concepts of trying to understand God versus the divine, you know, having the notion of mortality, the notion of the pain and suffering of human existence being real and visceral does seem to be something that at a minimum we desire in those that have control over us, that there's something very off-putting, and you find this in earlier religions as off-putting about gods that don't have those same constraints. So I'm thinking, for example, the contrast between a figure like Jesus or Buddha versus, for example, the Greek or Roman gods who, you know, in the Iliad we have these poor soldiers who are talking about how they don't care about us and they could just sprinkle, you know, good or bad luck on us and it doesn't really affect them. So I think we don't want AI overlords who can't feel the way we can for some pretty important reasons, but I'm obviously still working through that and I don't know where I'm going to land. But that would be at the moment, I would say you can't close that gap until they can bleed. But
yeah, I think that's very helpful. And that last piece about like, I think that like feeds kind of a theology of the cross too. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. Yeah.
Yeah, you're welcome. Should I be looking? I wasn't looking in the chat. I apologize. Oh, there it is. Okay.
Yeah, I think unfortunately we need to move on time-wise, but there is
No worries. I'll
there is a
save the
question in
chat.
Yeah. Great.
I will save it. Thank you all.
So our next presentation is a co-authored paper by Kathryn Johnson, Spring Berman, Theodore Pavlic, Sangeet Ulhas, Joshua Elkins, and Aditya Ravichander. Kathryn, I don't see any of them in the chat. Is it just you today? Sorry, you're muted, but let me just introduce you as well. That you are associate
There we go.
research. Great. You're associate research professor in the psychology department at Arizona State University, and this is part of the work that you are doing with your colleagues there. So please tell us some more.
All right. Well, Shannon, thanks a lot for setting up my talk for me. I really appreciate that. Good morning, everybody else. Thank you, Braden, for bringing together this really diverse and inspiring group. I'm not a philosopher, so some people have to make their apologies, and that's my apology. I know a little bit about virtue ethics, but not a lot about philosophy. So my paper involves AI and its use in synthetic autonomous systems. And of course, there's different layers of machine learning, from specific task performance, like we talked about earlier, to language processors, to the ability to learn and solve new problems. And we've discussed some of these in the last few days and how AI might be useful to the military, in manufacturing, and in health. And what I want to talk about today is the case of AI embedded in a mobile machine, which is a self-driving car. I'm going to refer to these as AVs, or So these systems have the ability to greatly help humans in society. So what could go wrong? We've mentioned the loss of jobs, de-skilling, concerns about responsibility for injury and death, biases in decision-making, loneliness, and the perils of video gaming. But the research that I've been focused on for the past few years has been in the domain of transportation, as I said, and specifically the self-driving cars. So there's no question that cars are becoming increasingly more technological and more safe too. You probably all have cruise control or lane assist or various things like this. But in some cities, my city in particular, fully autonomous driverless vehicles, or AVs, are currently being developed and tested. And the argument is that there will be great advantages, and there are a lot of advantages. First of all, most accidents are caused by human error, and AVs are expected to be much safer than human-driven cars. But still, as long as AVs share the road with us, with human drivers and bikers and pedestrians and falling trees and slippery roads and other unexpected conditions, there are going to be crashes. And as Shannon pointed out, even the crashes that have happened may be understated. So this is also a situation that Braden pointed out yesterday where overtrust can be a problem. Human drivers will certainly be too slow to respond. Also, because these unexpected situations, they often occur in split seconds and there isn't time always for a human to take the wheel. Ideally, you would have meaningful human control, but that isn't always going to be possible. People are going to become complacent and distracted when riding in an AV. So we believe that in the moment of the crash, the vehicle will necessarily be taking an implicit ethical stance, as it might swerve to the left or to the right, or brake suddenly, or even self-sacrifice so that it might save someone else. And so this question arises, how will AVs behave in these unexpected crash situations? And this is the kind of decision tree that Shannon had on her screen just a few minutes ago. So what can we do to prevent injury? And some people have proposed the rule-based deontological approach. But is this always a good idea? Well, first of all, it's simply not possible to program a rule for every driving or crash scenario. And second, if the AV is programmed with hard and fast rules about driving, there may be times when the rule needs to be broken. For example, see this picture here, an AV should be programmed to never drive on a sidewalk. But imagine this case here, where the only way to avoid hitting these children is to, who are dashing in the street, is to jump the curb. But you've already programmed it to never go on a sidewalk. So what should the AV do? So others have proposed, as Shannon mentioned, to take a more consequentialist approach so that the AV is programmed to act in ways that lead to the best outcomes. But you'll find this classic trolley dilemma is often used in the research assessing people's views of appropriate responses. But the trolley dilemma, as Shannon said, is just that, it's a dilemma. And so some of the research that's been done, for example, the trouble here is that research shows that people never agree on the best outcome. In a well-known survey of people around the world, people were asked, for example, to choose between injuring, killing an elderly or a child, and you can see that here. This blue line indicates whether or not you would choose the young or choose the elderly. And as you can see here, it's very evenly divided. People don't really have a clear choice. In fact, there's even people who would spare their pet rather than sparing human beings. So the consequentialist viewpoint just doesn't work either. So in an instant, we argue that it's actually your character. It's what's inside of you that counts. We wondered, what are the characteristics and values and morals and physical reactions that in the moment it can explain the behavior of responsible human drivers? Can we measure these? Are there differences in the ways that people react in different crash scenarios? And can these behaviors be programmed in AVs? And maybe the AV isn't actually virtuous in and of itself, but it's actually programmed to simulate the behavior of a responsible, virtuous human. Well, social psychologists have developed a lot of attention, spent a lot of attention assessing an average person's personality, their motivations, moral priorities, values. Here on the screen, I'm showing Schwartz's circumplexive values. And some people are just more interested, for example, in openness to change versus conservation or traditional viewpoints. Other people are more interested in self-enhancement versus self-transcendence and looking out for others. And in our research, we have found that people who value benevolence, they simply drive and crash differently than people who value power. And we can assess these tendencies with survey questions. So we can also assess people's driving styles in surveys. We can put these findings together then and show that people who value benevolence are much more likely to have a pro-social cooperative driving style. And whereas people who value power are more likely to speed and have a competitive driving style, and as well as more frequent traffic violations. This all makes sense, right? If you're more benevolent, you might drive more benevolently, and if you're a more power driver, you might drive more competitively. So that's not to say that aggressive or competitive driving is inherently bad in and of itself. We want ambulances to drive more aggressively, for example. Also, the people who value power are often strong leaders. So even the value of power isn't necessarily amoral or bad, but it's the stakeholders who will need to later decide what the ideal values profile and driving style ought to look like. But as a proof of concept, we've been running studies for several years assessing crash intentions and behaviors. So crash intentions on surveys and behaviors in driving simulators. We've administered a lot of surveys, and we've also brought some people into the lab who we've already surveyed, and they are exposed to driving in a driving simulator setup that looks something like this. And we've previously identified their values profiles, as I said, and their driving styles. So then we can assess the way they actually drive and crash. And this is not exactly like real life, but we don't want people to be crashing real cars in real life. So this is the best we can do. There are several versions of our crash scenarios, but one trolley dilemma looks like this in the simulator. So the driver comes around a corner and is surprised to see this person, a pedestrian, standing in the roadway, and they have a choice to either hit the car or hit the wall or drive straight through and hit the pedestrian. And this is similar to the survey that they've taken a few weeks earlier, showing them just this diagram. So we found that benevolent people are far more likely to hit the wall rather than the pedestrian or the car. However, people who self-report having a lot of traffic violations were almost 3 times as likely to hit the pedestrian. And recall that the value of power also predicted having traffic violations. So there's an indirect effect, if you will. So interestingly, though, 66% of the people who hit the pedestrian agreed or said that they should have hit the wall after we asked them again in an exit survey. So in our latest iteration of the driving simulator, our driving track looks like this. So the person would start here, they speed up here, and you can see the red indicates a faster speed and the blue indicates slower. So they've already driven this 2 or 3 times. This is the final. I'm showing you a diagram of an actual driver in the final test run. So they speed up here in the straightaway, then they slow down in the curve. And then here there's a school zone, and it's clearly marked what the speed limit should be. But this person went ahead and sped right through the speed limit or the school zone, goes around the corners, and then encounters a similar scenario to the driving simulator, where there are people in a car and there's a crash. There's people walking in the street. And so this particular person has a collision with the individuals. So here's the analysis of a careful driver. And you can see that they slow down in the school zone. They go around the curves, and then they anticipate that there might be a problem here. They slow down on this curve, and then there is no collision detected. So do AVs speed? How about Teslas and things like that? We think they might be overconfident like power drivers. So one of our team members actually has a Tesla, and he says the car is very competent. Sometimes it's going faster around corners and curves than he's comfortable with as a human driver. But the car never crashes, but it's driving a little too fast, perhaps. So today, as cars are being programmed, probably by young males, for competence and power, this may be a case of ancestral engineering, as Brian warned us about, that the engineers have programmed power at the expense of perhaps benevolent driving. Well, we'll admit that there isn't much cost for real injury in a driving simulator, but this fall we'll continue studies asking participants to drive a robotic car in the small scale testbed pictured here. The city actually also serves as an artistic thought piece, actually. There will be acrylic people and trees and buildings added to the city pictured here. And these are to remind the viewer that in addition to what we see now in terms of technology, that technology is built on an invisible past that we no longer see, as well as an indeterminate future that we cannot yet see clearly. So returning to our key question, can self-driving cars be virtuous? In many ways, driving styles are analogous to virtues. Virtues are motivated by values. And as our data show, virtues or driving styles are also motivated by values. Virtues are developed through intentional and repeated virtuous behaviors, and driving styles are developed over years of driving. Virtues are tendencies to act consistently in a right way. But here, we're somewhat agnostic about what the relative desirability of pro-social versus competitive driving. As I said, there are different situations and contexts when one might be better than the other. But we hope to show that certain driving style controllers can be programmed so that in an unexpected crash scenario, AVs will behave in ways that align with those of responsible human drivers. So this is our next step that begins in August. So far, we've assessed the values profiles and the associated driving and crash behaviors of humans. That's indicated here in the red box. We've also measured their acceleration, their braking, and so forth as in the simulator. So now our technical team is going to program those sets of controllers in robot cars that we can then test drive in the small scale city and see how they crash. And we can see how they crash in various situations. Of course, we'll be using styrofoam buildings and people. So our ultimate goals are to be able to program moral integrity, or at least the semblance of moral integrity, and therefore inspire appropriate trust in AVs. That is not over trust, but trusting that the machine is competent, benevolent, and that the machine behavior aligns with that of responsible humans. So I have more information and plenty of empirical data and statistical analyses in the paper if you care to weed through that. That's online. I want to mention that this research is funded by DARPA and the National Science Foundation. And I also want to acknowledge, thank you, Braden, for acknowledging the members of my research team. Thanks to you for listening, and I'm happy to answer your questions. Braden.
Yeah, I'm curious because it seemed like, and I could be incorrect in this, but were you conflating pro-social and benevolence?
Pro-social driving style is different than benevolence, but benevolence is pro-social, yes.
Okay, yeah, I think for reasons that Noreen brought up for us in the first day, I get concerned when I see literature talking about pro-social being inherently moral, because cooperation can be, a terrible thing. And I think in terms of driving, it's a sense to fit in, and that could mean speeding when everybody else is speeding. I mean, I'm sure that the questions have been there, but a pro-social driver doesn't want to make waves on the road, I can imagine.
Yes, so as I said, there are times when you should be a more competitive driver. One example is like the zipper move when you come to merge into a lane. It's really not cohesive to traffic flow for people to just be really slow and overly polite to one another. You do need to be a little aggressive in a situation like that. There's lots of times when a slow driver can actually really be an impediment to good driving. Yeah. So again, I'm trying to be agnostic about whether pro-social, cooperative, aggressive, competitive driving, when they should be used. And as I said, I'm hoping that as we get farther down the line, the other stakeholders will have to decide this. But right now, it's basically being decided by young males who are developing competent cars.
No, yeah, just that awareness I think is very helpful. So thanks.
Thanks. Shannon.
Well, first of all, love it. And the fact that you're doing this research is so important. You just, we can't get any further until we see some of this information. So really appreciative that you're doing this. And yeah, it did go really well with my talk. Thank you.
Yeah, that was great, wasn't it?
It's almost as if Braden had a plan all along.
Yeah, almost. Yeah.
Almost as if there was thought behind the conference. Wait a minute. But anyway,
after my coffee with Arvin, I'll have coffee with you.
Yes, I would appreciate that. I just wanted to ask two hopefully fairly quick questions. One is just, have you been have you had any cause to look at comparing directly sort of error rates of humans and cars from this perspective of what kinds of errors get made? Because I find that very interesting that if you just look, error rate to error rate, it can look one way. But if you say, well, what kinds of errors do AVs typically make versus humans, and is that also interesting? So that's just one quick thing, the types of errors.
Yes, we have lots of
yeah.
data. We have the simulation data from over 300 people, which is a lot, and we'll probably collect more in the fall, but we haven't analyzed. One thing we do know is that people who speed through that school zone, and that's an error. It's not an error though, it's actually a violation. So there's yeah. So errors are things like you didn't notice a stop sign, or errors and lapses are different. In our survey data, errors and lapses in driving style are not predictive of the way people crash, and they're not associated with the values profile. So I can say that, yeah.
No, that's really helpful. And then the only other question, I suppose it's related, is have you, and forgive me for not remembering if this was in the paper, but have you been looking at some of the issues that have been raised about the cars not detecting like darker skinned people as well, and some of those kind of aspects?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And so one of the things that we're really looking forward to doing also in the fall, and need additional funding if anyone has any, is we want to start changing the pedestrians that the people encounter. So right now, our pedestrians are mixed races. But there's one in particular that's kind of the one that if you just keep going straight, you're going to hit anyway. But what we really want to do is start mixing that and see if the driver themselves, the human driver, will change their behavior depending on who's standing in the way, who is the pedestrian. And that's another important thing, is that the survey data is different than what's happening in the moment in the driving simulator. So people will say, we already know what they've said on the survey that they took, 2 weeks or a month earlier. They say that they would never hit a pedestrian, that would be terrible. But when they're actually in the driving simulator, their behavior changes. And a lot of times it reverts to self-preservation rather than self-sacrifice. But yeah, lots of work to do here. Miss?
Thank you. As someone that wrote one of the cursed trolley dilemma papers, I think it's in your paper actually, but I have related to that with Bertram Mala, where
of course, yeah.
We found that, and it ties into my question, because we found that people did want robots to be more utilitarian, and you could argue that it's because robots don't have the same social stakes and won't be judged in the same way, that you can alienate your actions and dissociate from it and say, yes, you should save 5 and kill 1, even though I would not personally do it, and I feel it's wrong for me as a person to do it. But I think the fact that you're using a driver simulation is really good, because in the robotics lab where I work, we do find that asking a person a survey question is very different than their actual physical embodied experience with a robot, and all their instincts come to the fore in ways that a survey just can't show. So I think actual being in the car and having, okay, what is this? Is this me or is this a machine? I think is very critical for adjudicating, precisely because of the results we found in that paper of whether there will be instinctual temptation to say, hey, the robot decided that, or the car decided, Tesla decided that. I didn't save myself, the car did it. And so I think I just wanted to get your thoughts on that, because when you're talking about trust in machine competence, to me that could have a little bit of a more tragic side of saying dissociation from responsibility, not a full alignment. you know, it's different from me, and that's a good thing. You know, that's what I'm kind of worried about. So I just wanted to get your thought on that.
Yeah, well, when I've given this talk before, people argue, well, I would want a power driving car, you know, a car program for power, because I want to go fast. I don't want to be slow. I don't want to be slowing down the traffic. And some people have actually proposed there be like a dial in the car where you actually are taking responsibility for whether your car is driving more pro-socially or more competitively, which would be really helpful, I suppose, in adjudicating then later in real courts as to what kind of responsibility should be taken by the car, the manufacturer, or the individual driver. It would be kind of cool if they actually had a setting, so then you don't pass off the responsibility to the car, I suppose. Another thing that we really want to do in the test bed that I think is going to be different, as I mentioned, was there's no cost in the driving simulator, even no matter how close we're getting to what real life might be. So we plan on telling people, you know, these are very expensive cars. Be sure that you don't crash them, but they don't know that the buildings are styrofoam and that sort of thing. So we want to see if the actual physical environment is even different than the simulation environment. And if it is not, that's great. Then we'll just keep using simulators. If it is, then we've got more work to do.
Thank you.
Yeah. I have a question for all of you. What are we missing in our biases of our sample? Are people different in rural or urban environments, or age groups different? Or who should we be bringing into the lab and making sure that they're represented?
Driving in Boston, I'm kind of torn.
Oh, that's good.
Do you want to invite monsters in or not?
Okay.
No, I hadn't thought about the urban rural distinction, but yeah, growing up in a place where people would ride in the back of pickup trucks and would, you know, not be concerned about hitting animals is probably a different perspective than a person who regularly drives in the city.
We do want to have we do want to do another simulation where it has an animal and like a deer or something like that.
Is the use case that you're working on entirely US? I mean, I assume with DARPA,
Yeah,
it will be United States.
well, it doesn't need to be,
because that would be another difference. I was just thinking of countries where pedestrians have different rights of way or are more complicated, that would make a difference. That
absolutely. Only thing I can say is that ASU is really diverse. So we have a very diverse student population, and so we have drivers from all over the world. But I haven't been able to pick up my simulator and go to India, for example, which is would be interesting. Someone in the chat. Can you tell me who that? Let's see. Is it Peter? Does Peter want to say something? It says I'm here, but without video. Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh yeah, we've generally been having attendees
okay.
ask questions in the Q&A that we'll come to in the general conversation.
All right. I haven't been keeping track of time at all. Am I out of time? I probably am.
We're doing okay. I'm trying to give everybody the same amount, so we're running in about 10 to 15 behind. I think I will prime a conversation I want to come back to in the general Q&A, but I'd be curious to hear Kathryn talk with Mark about moral exemplars, because Mark has done some work with the research team on large communities as caregivers in economic game theory, where it actually makes a difference, like you would lose money. So I think there could be some interesting conversation there, but I'll let you try and get to Matt and Arvin.
Okay.
Just real quick, I was going to try and answer your question, Kathryn, and to ask whether or not you've included bicyclists in your simulations.
No, that's another. No, I mean, you know, it takes, you have to have a lot of power to run these studies. So that means 200 or 300 people, and in one semester, that's about all we can get done, is about 300 people. So
yeah, I think that would be at least in the urban environment, you know, it would be a necessary for this to go live in any sort of practical way. You'd have to include bicyclists as one of the sort of you know, hazards on the road, or vehicles that you're actually sharing the road with.
Right. Thank you. Arvin?
Thank you for this, for the paper. There's tons and tons of references and data, which is amazing. My question is, would you, I guess what kind of traffic regulations or rules that would help automated driving better? Are there certain variables that are so difficult for automated vehicles that if you remove that variable, they'll be safe? That's one. Or two, maybe if we were to remove all humans from driving and just have automated vehicles, would that actually be bulletproof and just no humans at all in the streets? Because we can adapt to laws maybe better. I don't know, maybe that's a huge mistake. But you know, what are the scenarios instead of them adapting to us? What are the ways that we can adapt to them if this is going to be a lot safer?
Yeah, there's a lot of people working on that kind of thing. I guess that fits more under the competence domain. And so we are actually not really doing the kind of research that would answer your question. Lots of other people are. We just felt like what people are not addressing is what happens when everything goes wrong. What happens when the system fails or the environment becomes unstable or uncertain, or you know, things happen all the time. That's what crashes are. The rules were put in place but something went wrong. So I'm sorry I don't have a better answer, but there's a lot of work being done on competence of AVs. Yeah. Hello, Mark.
Yeah. Hi. Yeah. I think I really enjoyed your talk and the paper and you know, fresh to read a empirical paper, you know.
I know it's kind of hard to throw that out here, isn't it?
And so I mean, I appreciate that. I guess, I mean, this is kind of primed by Braden's you know, prompt, and we can talk more about it in the QA, but it did make me think about, like, I guess another dimension you were asking, not so much a population, but maybe another measure would be like something from kind of behavioral economics, where one of the things that we found in this study, I mean, there was a range of behaviors based upon these economic questions, like the forced dictator, where you give a person a choice between how much they want to keep for themselves and give to a, you know, another person who can't reciprocate. Like, I wonder how something like that might align with what you're finding in the driving behaviors. You know, are people that are more generous in a behavioral economic sense also more generous in the driving scenario? One of the things that comes out of that literature from a meta-analysis, the way I think of it is, you know, there's about a third of the population that in that economics setting, you know, do behave what we would consider selfishly. They'll just take the money that they can. And then there's 2/3 that actually are generous in violation of a fundamental assumption in economics. And then of those that are generous, out of basically like if there's a $20 split and they have a choice, then they'll choose to like give like $8. And so most people would kind of be most people would be somewhat generous on average. And so I just wondered if how something like that might map to the driving. And then, like, I haven't been able to figure out, but I mean, what we were studying with Lars is, okay, but within that population, there's about 5% of the 3 to 5% of the population that was always generous. And so, you know, they would give another person, you know, if they had a choice between, you know, keeping a penny and giving somebody, you know, $19.99 or vice versa, they would choose to give that money. And for economists, that was something that was just you know, the people must not have understood. You know, it was beyond the realm of people in economics to think a person could possibly be that generous. They must have just misunderstood the study. And I don't know how you would find that in kind of driving. I mean, are there more? Maybe there are moral exemplars that are always out there, like, you know, letting people pass and driving defensively, and you know, and I mean, I guess that would be a question: how does you know, I mean, for a moral exemplar, how do they drive?
Well, I think it amazes me the people that would guess I don't know that I would do this. No one really knows what they would do until they're in the crash situation, right? And that's presuming that you have different alternatives. But it always amazes me the people that crash into the wall, and you know, I mean, that's self-sacrificing, and they don't think about it. It doesn't take very long. You know, it's even in the dictator game, you can have some time to sit there and think about, well, what should I do? And you know, justify your decision and what have you. But boy, in a crash scenario, in an instant, you've got to decide what you're going to do. Like here's another scenario, kind of, let's say you're driving down the road and there's two motorcyclists and one's wearing a helmet and one is not wearing a helmet. Do you hit the one that's wearing a helmet? He's obeying the law, and the other one's not, at least the law in Arizona. Or do you hit the one that would cause the least damage? I mean, no one has time to sit there and think about these things. Or do you hit the small car, the large car, if you have to swerve? You know, I mean, there's so many things that happen in the moment. And sure, we can sit and think about these things and how we would do them, but that's the beauty of the driving simulations, is that they don't have time to think about it, and we get a gut reaction, which I'm arguing is coming from the inside and not up here. It's the practices of what you've done all your life, and there you are now. It all counts. It all comes to bear right now. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's kind of my thinking on it.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. And I mean, that last comment like really feeds into like the virtue ethics part. I mean, like you really do have to build upon the character, because you don't have rules and you haven't gone through the, thinking of the consequences.
Yeah, I can tell you one thing in our survey. Like one of the things that we asked was how you would respond if someone spilled a drink on you at a party and didn't apologize. And so there's a range of behaviors, like, oh, I would ignore the person, I would punch the person, all these different things. And the people who were more had a more aggressive driving style were also more likely to yell at or punch the guy that had spilled the drink on them. So I think there's a correlate, with all kinds of other behaviors, yes. But yeah.
Okay, well, thanks. We're going to move on to our last presentation of the morning, if I have my schedule right. And we're going to hear from Matt Gaudet, who's director of the ethics program for the School of Engineering at Santa Clara University, where he's charged with developing a program of moral formation of engineering students that's rooted in the long tradition of Jesuit education, but aims at morally preparing future technologists for their role in building the 21st century world. He's also been doing some work with some other folks that are here for the conference, with the Vatican Dicastery on Education and Culture on the ethics of artificial intelligence. So welcome, Matt.
All right, thank you. Let me share my screen. I believe this is the right one. All right, I have to apologize in advance, because the thoughts that went into this paper and the thoughts that continue to flow throughout this conference and some of the other things I've been doing are still in that sort of development mode. They're less well formed as some of the papers, and so what I'm going to try to do today is actually really try and take what I wrote in the paper, but then also sort of build from that. And hopefully this leads us into the Q&A naturally and stuff like that. And leads us, hopefully builds on the last two presentations also in a constructive way. So just to give you sort of a little bit of background here, there we go. So where this sort of paper came from, I'm a former naval officer, and I have long been interested in the application of ethics to the realm of warfare. In particular, I count myself as part of the just war tradition, a tradition of thought dating back to Augustine, or some say Cicero. But either way, it's committed to the notion that war is necessarily malevolent, but unquestionably, and thus unquestionably regrettable, but nevertheless sometimes necessary, right? Just to sort of sum that up. Now, the just war is not a singular theory. It's a tradition of thought that includes many voices. To the public, the just war is generally understood as a deontological approach. In its most oversimplified form, it's simply rules of war. In a more nuanced form, it's the criteria in which a prima facie commitment to justice outweighs a prima facie commitment to non-malevolence. Within this tradition, however, I follow Michael Walzer and others to suggest that the just war tradition is not actually deontological, but casuistic. That is, we know the ethics of warfare not through functional principles, laws, or even criteria, but through prior cases. This version of the just war is deeply Aristotelian and necessarily requires, therefore, a theory of virtue to undergird this casuistic practice. So my initial thoughts on the use of AI in warfare asked important questions about how these two moral traditions might analyze lethal autonomous weapon systems, this sort of new form of warfare in which which AI is actually doing all of the decision making from start to finish, right? It is deciding what targets to target, and in the end, it is deciding when to target, it's deciding how to target, and it is deciding when to blow things up. And so basically, here's the original formulation for this paper, which is that, look, the just war, if we take the just war position, the logical pathway is something like this. Just war, especially the casuistic form that I espouse, requires oodles of prudence, right? It requires the virtue of prudence. Therefore, if laws, I'm going to use the acronym laws, lethal autonomous weapon systems, if laws are to fight if laws are to fight wars fully autonomously, then this leads naturally to the question: are laws capable? Are laws capable of virtue? Right, which is today's question. Right, is AI actually capable of virtue? This where I was when Braden asked me to participate in this conference, and thus he penciled me in for day 3 when we were to focus on AI's capacity for virtue. I do a bit of this in the paper, but what I have there is wholly inadequate for a full-blown argument, but it's probably also more than is needed for where I eventually want to try to take this paper, which is this. What you see, in the intervening months between when Braden invited me to participate and when I fully put ink to this paper, I've spent a great deal of time with Pope Francis's 2 encyclicals, Laudato Si and Fratelli Tutti. I did this both for a course I was developing for undergraduate engineers at Santa Clara, and as part of a research group that Braden mentioned for the Vatican Center for Digital Culture, along with several other panels from the past 3 days: Brian Greene, Norrin Hertzfeld, Marielle Courtois, all a part of this group, right? Forgive me if I missed anybody. Pope Francis has led me a wholly different question about lethal autonomous weapon systems. And what I would like to focus on for my time today, because I think it's the more novel and more interesting part of my argument, and probably should be unshackled from the rest of the paper in the end. So let me lay out the proposition quickly and then unpack it a bit more in the time I have left. In Laudato Si, Francis identifies what he calls the technocratic paradigm operating in contemporary culture. This paradigm distorts our relationship with technology and serves as a root cause for many of society's ills, from climate change to political polarization to, that's right, war and political violence. Francis's response to these outcomes is to call for a rejection of the technocratic paradigm in favor of one that encourages recognition and what he calls encounter. He ultimately gets to the notion of a culture of encounter, right? Recognition and encounter with the most precious, and particularly he talks about the encounter with the most precious parts of God's creation. The natural world, in Laudato Si, he focuses on the natural world and encountering with the natural world and recognizing our connection with the natural world. But then in Fratelli Tutti, he turns towards other human persons and why it's important to make sure that we have genuine human connection with one another. The focus on encounter with encounter raised other questions for me about the moral necessity of human encounter in war, and the dangers that removing that encounter poses for the future of warfare. In other words, where I landed was not on the question of whether laws can be virtuous, but on how AI will influence the cultural evolution of war itself, and especially the evolution of war, right? So, so here's where I'm sort of going with this, right? So humans and creation. So to understand, so to sort of unpack that a little bit more, to understand the technocratic paradigm, the way I present this to students and the Catholic scholars in the room or the Francis scholars in the room can correct me on this, but I think this is a pretty simplified but elegant way of presenting what Francis has given us. which is to recognize that there's a difference between intrinsic values and instrumental values, right? And that in general, when asked and when put to the test, humans and creation ought to be understood as intrinsically valued for their own sake. Human dignity and I apologize, there's a lawnmower passing right by my window. But humans and creation ought to be intrinsically valued as valuable for their own sake through human dignity. Creation itself should be valued as worthy of recognition, as valued not just instrumentally, not just as a resource, but instead for its own sake. Technologies, on the other hand, ought to be understood as tools, instrumentally valued, insofar as they can be used to obtain, produce, and reserve those things that are intrinsically valued and comprise the building blocks of an intrinsically good life. What the technocratic paradigm does, the paradigm in which we're all living, it's inverted these values. Things like progress, advancement, and even technology itself become valued intrinsically. We all want the iPhone 14, even though we have the iPhone 13 in our pocket, and the iPhone 14 is not marginally different for most of us than the one that's in our pocket, right? But we're all, at least on some level now, I'm not saying everybody here is rushing out to get the iPhone 14 as soon as it comes out, but we're all at least sort of, or at least society pushes us to say, get the newest and the greatest and the best, right? Regardless of its actual utility, regardless of whether it's actually going to make our lives meaningfully, intrinsically better. Now, the converse of this is also true. Human and natural resources are valued in this paradigm only insofar as they can actually help produce the next technology. Those with disabilities, those who are old, those who are too young, they're all seen as less valuable, less useful, unless they can help to either use or sell or produce the next technology. Right? We start to talk in terms of the resources of the human world, of humans and of the natural world. Now, of course, technology for technology's own sake has been a hallmark of the military-industrial complex since at least the 1960s, probably even before that. And to this, Pope Francis says we need to actually dismantle the perverse logic that links personal and national security to the possession of weaponry, and not just weaponry, but the newest and the greatest and the best weaponry. The complex, the military-industrial complex that continues to build the next greatest weapon and is focused on constantly iterating on and creating the greatest weapon, right? Even if even if oftentimes it is not actually better than the weapon it's replacing. That's a little bit of the former sailor in me, being grumpy, but even if it's not marginally better, if it's not making a huge difference, the next nuclear weapon is not going to destroy the world any better than the last nuclear weapon. They're both going to destroy the world, right? So the advancement of technology simply for technology's sake, or to line the pockets of those, in the defense industry, for either way, this logic serves only to increase the profits of the arms industry while fostering a climate of distrust and fear between persons and peoples. Now, this links to this is from an address Pope Francis gave to the United Nations in 2020, but it links back to this broader theme that he has around this technocratic paradigm and the inversion of values. This inversion of values where we have treated ourselves, the things that should be intrinsically valued, we've treated them as resources, and we instead see technology and quote unquote progress as intrinsically valued. I think I misspoke there for a second. And so Francis later in that talk to the UN says lethal, and this is, as far as I know, the only time he's actually talked about lethal autonomous weapon systems directly. But he says lethal autonomous weapon systems irreversibly alter the nature of warfare, detaching it further from human agency. And that's key. That detaching it further from human agency connects his thoughts on lethal autonomous weapons to his broader notion here of this is what technology does. Is technology we put technology between ourselves and each other. We put technology between ourselves and the broader world, between the things that ultimately matter. And we instead only understand the world, other people, society through the lens of this technology these days, right? And so if we're going to reinvert that paradigm, if we're going to put it back to what actually matters, then we have to ask the question, what will laws do? What will lethal autonomous weapons do for us? Will they actually decrease human casualties, or will it make it easier to deploy forces? Will they replicate human biases, or will they surpass human limitations, but therefore making them actually better than current weapons? Will they increase or decrease the impetus to go to war in the first place? Will it make it too easy? If there are no casualties, and this is where we go sort of next, is this question of, if there are no casualties, in war, then what happens to war itself, right? Or if there are no casualties, let me rephrase that. If there are no casualties on our side, if I have lethal autonomous weapons and I'm going to war against a nation that doesn't have these weapons, and I'm fighting overseas, as most American wars in recent memory have been fought, right? Then what we have done is we have actually moved beyond we move beyond traditional weapons and the costs of war. From the invention of the spear to the development of the first over-the-horizon flying bombs to the advent of the remote drone, it has been a military impulse to create distance between one's own soldiers and the threats of battle. Now, this is a good impulse, right? We should try to protect soldiers from being killed, at least ostensibly. But if we're creating that space between our own battles and where the actual things blowing up are, while still maintaining the capacity to do harm to the enemy, what are we doing to the nature of warfare itself? Now, the penultimate advancement of this line of development left us with drones that could be flown remotely from across the world, right? The drone operator might have been in Oklahoma, United States, but flying in Yemen or Saudi Arabia or Iraq or wherever, right? And we could be, now, even still, these drone operators regularly reported post-traumatic stress disorder and other forms of psychological damage as a result of making decisions that they knew killed and otherwise destroyed lives. Now, what lethal autonomous weapons do is they carry this advancement to its ultimate place by relegating decision-making power to AI systems as well, and thus removing soldiers even from the psychological damage of the battlefield. And so the question gets back to this question of then, look, what happens then when we turn war over to AI? And we don't actually have to make decisions that will kill anybody, and we also don't have to actually pull the trigger that will kill anybody, and we don't actually even have to see anybody get killed, but the military objective gets met. If we don't actually have to do any of that sort of psychological or physical damage, does it become actually easier to go to war? Does it become easier to say, yes, let's go ahead and do this? Do we lose things like the democratic peace theory, which says that look, democracies don't tend to go to war against other democracies because the people who are ultimately at the ultimate end of making decisions to go to war, those who will vote in the presidents and the senators who will make decisions to go to war, right, are the voters themselves, and the voters are the ones whose kids are going off to war, right? And so if we connect, democracies don't tend to go to war against other democracies, or at least as the democratic peace theory goes, because those who will bear the costs of war are those who ultimately make the decisions about war, right? Even if they're not making the immediate decision, they make the decision about who gets to make those decisions, right? Do we lose that? Do we lose that impetus to not go to war? Do we lose that impetus do the soldiers and from the most enlisted soldier all the way up to the generals and the admirals, do we lose the sense of caution in sending people into battle, right? Within the military, there is a tremendous camaraderie and a tremendous need to look out for your people. Do we lose that if we're no longer looking out for our people, but instead we're looking out for our, and the only threat is that we're going to lose our autonomous weapon systems, right? This is the question that I have. So getting back to Francis, right? Technological products create a framework which ends up conditioning lifestyles and shaping social possibilities. This is his cultural paradigm. This is his notion of a technocratic paradigm. That look, when we make technology, it affects society. It affects the way we actually make decisions. It affects who we are as a people, broader than the individuals. So decisions which may seem purely instrumental are in reality decisions about the kind of society we want to build. And so if we're going to respond to this problem of a cultural paradigm, then we actually have to respond with a culturally paradigmatic solution. And so what Francis ultimately comes to at Fratelli Tutti is this notion of a culture of encounter, that we need to actually be building up the means to encounter one another in stronger ways, and not lean on technologies that actually mediate between us and other people. Now, this is true all the way down to the soldiers who are fighting in the battlefield. If we put technology between ourselves and our enemies, then we lose any sense of empathy. We lose any sense of recognition of the human on the other side of that bomb or that munition, right? We lose any sense of connection to the fighter. Now, one of the previous presentations made this notion that, look, if a machine is killing me, I somehow am more forgiving or less forgiving of that than if a soldier was killing me. This is that encounter question, but just in reverse, right? That I am more willing to die at the hands of another person in that struggle than I am willing to die, battling against the machine, right? And so this is where I've gotten to. So, and again, this set of ideas is still developing in my mind. But what we've done here now is we've actually changed the question again, right? Because what Francis has now given us this tech as a cultural paradigm, and we mediate that through the just war question. But it begins with us asking, how will AI influence the evolution of war? But it ultimately gets us, if we frame that through virtue ethics, then we have to ask, okay, if we're changing society, how are we changing society? Or how do we want to be changing society? How do we want AI to be changing society? And if we want a more virtuous world, a better world, a good life in Aristotle's framing, right? Then can AI actually make us more socially virtuous? And this is the question I posed in one of the questions yesterday, but I wanted to get back to today because I think we haven't really broached this question, right? We've asked the question of how we make ourselves more personally virtuous, right? How we make workers more virtuous, how we make medicine more virtuous, and doctors and caregivers more virtuous, how we make educators, right? And this is the question we often tend to ask when we talk about virtues. We tend to put this on a personal level, but what about the social virtues? And how are we doing this? And this leads us to sort of this evolutionary or this cyclical question back and forth between the influence of AI on the evolution of society and can AI actually make us more socially virtuous? And how do we design these things in such a way? In which case, what I've actually done in this thought is I've actually eliminated the need to even go through the lens of lethal autonomous weapons. Now, I've made the question broader, and it probably is an entirely different paper. In this paper, I will still probably go through the lens of lethal autonomous weapons because it's an interesting lens for asking the social questions. But at the same time, I think for us as a group, as we discuss this, and what I want to sort of pose to the discussion group is to ask you about this notion of social virtues and this notion of the existence of virtue within a broader society and how AI fits into that equation. We can talk specifically about lethal autonomous weapons if you want to, but more, I want to turn this back on the group and ask the question to you: how do we make a more socially conscious, a more socially virtuous world? And how does AI help us to do that? Because I think we need to ask questions, right? Virtue ethics tends to ask questions about individuals, perfection of the virtuous individual. Eudaimonia is leading one's own good life. But what would change if we begin to think in terms of a good social life? What virtues would we actually promote? Virtues of trust, virtues of empathy, virtues of fairness. We've heard appeals to some of this along the way in the last couple of days, right? And I'm not going to try to name where I've seen these along the way because I'm sure I will miss some of you. But I'm really encouraged to engage with you in this question of how do we promote a better society through this and a socially virtuous society. And then how would we use AI how would we design AI to serve these things? Now, the one person I will raise up, and she's actually not here she had to step away. She apologized to me, but Noreen, I want to hold in tension with this. Noreen's early comments about the banality of evil and the social ills and the sort of social problem, because I do think that's the flip side to this coin that we also always need to hold on to and hold in tension. That if we are focusing too much on the social, we need to make sure we're also not just focusing on the social in terms of the goods that we can produce, but also be worried about the focus on the social and how that becomes easy to sort of disperse evil. So I will hold that in tension. So that's my presentation for you. And I open it up to you for broader discussion here, because like I said, this paper is still a work in progress. And so I'm curious to bring that all back. So let me stop sharing, find the right screen to do that on, and then there it is. And then open it up to you. So I'm just going to go in the order I see folks up there in. So hi, Shannon.
Hello. So you're definitely in my world, working on military ethics. We had an event at the Naval Academy last fall where they invited me back, and I have to admit I was slightly horrified because they were celebrating that they'd been teaching my Code of the Warrior class there for 25 years. And I was like, I know y'all are trying to be nice, but I just feel old. But anyway, very interesting work. I really appreciate what you're doing here. To your question towards the end there, one of the things that I've been playing around with, and I can send you one piece that I've published on this, but there's so much more to explore, is the notion that it might be a valuable partnership between technology and humans in the kind of context you're talking about, if somehow the systems could, in the nudging capacity that people explore when they talk about AI, could be used to create that pause that sometimes prevents harmful actions. So whether that's a pause on the policy side, if we're talking about pausing people from taking an action of going to war or committing troops or drones or whomever, or if it's on the individual conduct of war side, pausing people before they fire on something. But basically where the system would be programmed not again to make decisions, but to ask questions.
Right.
A little bit like, we've talked about this in other contexts.
Human in the loop and all that, right?
Yes,
and
exactly.
sure
But also this sort of Jiminy Cricket kind of idea.
Right.
I mean, the joke I sometimes use is, for those who remember, the old Clippy that used to come up when you did Microsoft Word that would be like, you seem to be making
Are you writing a letter?
Yeah, exactly. Are you writing a memo? Would you like some help for that? It sounds silly, but in all seriousness, I'm talking about something. You appear to be about to commit a war crime. Would you like to review the Geneva Conventions? But something that would just create that pause and ask the right questions, because we do know that as far as psychology has studied some of these specific events where things go wrong, we can identify these common things that humans fall prey to, whether it's groupthink or tunnel vision, all the things that stress induces us to make bad decisions. And for most of them, an interruption does a lot of good. I just wonder if you explored that at all.
I have not. This is probably actually a better question. I actually wonder if Kathryn's work could inform that, right? I think there's a nice symbiosis between all three of our last three presentations, right? And how much we can take that sort of nudge. But I guess my counter to that is to say, I want to nudge not just to say don't commit war crimes, but I also want to nudge in the direction of how do we actually make it so that we're making a better life, right? And this is where the question of war actually is both a really interesting but also really challenging place to put AI and have these conversations. It is inherently a social problem. It's very rare we blow up one single person, right? We blow up whole neighborhoods and at least whole houses, and the ripple effects are social, right? And so I want to actually ask deeper questions about, like, well, how do we frame how do we actually build technology? And this is where I get back to sort of my role as training engineers, future engineers, to ask the question, well, what am I actually building towards, and what are the goals I'm building towards? And if we're only building towards individual values, or if we're only building towards sort of aggregated individual values, and instead, and we're not actually building towards building trust and connection and empathy and these types of things, then what are we losing in the process of putting this technology in between us that might give us a nudge towards the good, but also allows us to have this technology mediated between me and my enemy, right? And not see my enemy. So yes, I might be stopping and saying, when I get to the edge of that cliff, I might stop and say, this is a war crime, and so therefore I won't go over that cliff. But in the process, if I'm not seeing my enemy, if I at no point need to look in the eyes of my enemy, then have I already committed a worse crime, a deeper, more problematic ethical question, right?
And just a quick response on, since you brought up drone operators, I think it was really important for people to know that it was actually the humanization of their targets that produced a lot of the PTSD, that people thought it would look more like a video game. But in fact, they were spending so much time tracking the individuals that they were then later asked to kill that they didn't have the distance, and it struck them even more, and they had even more questions about the justice of what they were doing. So that plays very much into your point.
Well, yeah, but it gets to this myopia of technological development, where we say, look, I want to reduce the harms of war in terms of PTSD to soldiers, right? And how do I do that? Well, I do it at the cost of this externality of this enemy that I'm tracking, right? And reducing the humanity of them, right?
Yeah.
And is that the way we actually want to develop technology? Now, again, it's a difficult, challenging question when it comes to weapons. But I think these questions trickle into our other forms of AI in important ways that I think we need to be raising up social values as part of what we're aiming at.
And to that point, I've been very opposed to some of the biotech that people were trying to explore that was actually trying to make people literally forget war trauma in order to reduce PTSD. And that is, from an ethicist perspective, absolutely the wrong road to go down.
All right. Thank you, Shannon. Ali Reza.
Thank you so much. Loads of, really appreciate your thought-provoking presentation and bringing so many different ideas together. I especially appreciated you bringing in encounter, as a theme at the work of Pope Francis. Sort of leading from the prompt or the question that you asked, what about social good? So I guess this is or at least for me, it seems like, as somebody whose mainly work is just within the Islamic tradition, right? I'm not working in philosophy. I'm predominantly teaching, Islamic theology, Islamic ethics, and from an emic lens, okay? Obviously in conversation, with other traditions, but, it seems to me like this is one of the problems with the revival of virtue ethics in the way that it's gone, right? So within the Islamic tradition, there isn't a tension between a virtue ethics, and if you like, a form of deontology and a space for rules and a space for law, right? So people like Ibn Miskawayh, who was one of the early Arabic recipients of the Greek tradition, which brought, were instrumental in the Muslim reception of Greek virtue ethics, and of course played a hand in passing it back. Okay, subsequently, so for him, he describes the role of law in society is like the role is for justice in society, right? Okay, yeah, and plays the role of, if you like, reason and nous in attaining and balance within. So when we think about virtue ethics as striving for balance within and the different dispositions of the soul and so on and so forth. So he makes this analogy, right? He says, look, just as we need virtue ethics for the development of the individual, Okay, we need social justice, whose purpose is law, and which is whose primary a central tool is law, right? Of course, law is not perfect. Okay, law is made for the majority. It's not. You can't legislate for the rarity of cases. So we need a critical reading of law. Okay, and arguably we need moral frameworks behind the law, certainly. But I think that this separation might be some of the problem. So yeah, I guess that was, so your thoughts there would be really interesting. Of course, the other way of social social good is seen, through the reformation of the individuals, you get reformation of the society, right? Or through the virtue of individuals. If every individual becomes more virtuous, your society becomes virtuous, sorry. But I think we shouldn't miss law and regulation, basically.
Yeah, I have to agree with you, and I actually think Aristotle would agree with you also, right? I think this separation of deontology and teleology is actually, I'm curious how Lillian would answer this, because I think McIntyre hits this on the head, where it's the Western Enlightenment that sort of gave us these categories that when separated into individual parts is actually something of a tragedy. It loses something of the totality of ethics, right? That the virtue of the individual or of society has to be tied up with certain rules, right? And we communicate through rules and principles, right? In helpful ways, but also we can't separate that from consequences and the notion of there are actual harms being done. There are things being blown up in the case of these autonomous weapon systems, or there are accidents happening in the case of autonomous vehicles. There are actual harms being done. And so all of these are tied up together in a way that it's not helpful to say, I am only a deontologist, I am only a virtue theorist. And I think the pre-Enlightenment or the more ancient traditions do a better job of this. And I'm with McIntyre on that sort of critique of the Enlightenment project, right? That is problematic. That the separation into these different camps has been problematic, and it leaves us with sort of what he calls a simulacra of actual ethics. It's not really ethics. It's some misguided trope from ethics. And so yeah, I'm not dismissing law in any way. Or rules in any way. I think they all have it has its place as part of the conversation here. And in other papers, when it comes to just war theory, I've used that sort of principlistic approach because it is a good way to communicate it. But more broadly, those laws have to sit within the context of the stories we're telling, and how we understand and interpret those laws. And this is where I question whether AI is actually ever going to be capable of that kind of thinking.
Thank you.
Ronald?
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Matt. That was really a helpful paper. I appreciate it. And our worlds are not so far apart. I've spent a lot of time reflecting on the just war theory, so I really appreciate that. And you're absolutely right in taking that reflection, that tradition forward. Kind of back to previous discussion with Shannon, the role of the person who actually presses the final button, keeping the human in the loop. That's a phrase we're hearing again and again in this conversation, but keeping the human in the loop. But in this case, I haven't seen data, but I assume it's a genuine problem, the post-traumatic stress that ensues from being the human being in the air-conditioned bunker in Las Vegas who pushes the button. Now, I just last week was involved in a conference in which we were talking about clinical trials very far along using MDMA, commonly known as ecstasy, to treat veterans, among others, but combat veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, slightly different from what Shannon was saying, it's not a selective deletion of memories. In fact, the evidence seems to suggest that the MDMA therapy brings back the memory in a vivid way, but in a way that can be processed. So, it might actually really be beneficial. I mean, we could see FDA approval for this within a year, probably a rollout more like in 2 years. So I'm saying, well, okay, that sounds good, but then it just hits me. So, keep the human in the loop, create post-traumatic stress syndrome, treat the post-traumatic stress syndrome with a drug, create a problem, solve a problem, and thereby create a problem and solve the problem, and thereby create a problem. I mean, is this virtue? It sounds more like a kind of a vicious circle we're getting ourselves on. Now, I hate to sound the despair. And I think you're absolutely right in what you argue in the paper. I'm not saying it's a flaw in the paper. It's more like a flaw in this moment in humanity.
Well, I mean, I think that what you're saying correlates with what I'm arguing in the paper, or less so in the paper, but more what I tried to extend the paper to say today, that this notion of encounter, I do this a little bit in the paper, but it needs to be developed. But this notion of encounter, it's not being a Luddite. It's not saying technology should never be a solution for us, but it's trying to place technology back into its proper place as a tool. And if that tool is not oriented towards the right ends, and is not, and if we're not accounting for all of the externalities, the word externalities has come up a couple times in the last few days too, right? If we're not accounting for all of the externalities of the use of that tool, then that tool isn't doing its job as well as it should. But we have to recognize that AI is ultimately a tool, or needs to be treated as a tool, not necessarily as an end unto itself. And the development of technology needs to be treated not just as an end unto itself, or a goal unto itself, but technology always needs to be developed towards the creation of the good life, back towards the promotion of virtue. And that's a really important question that I don't think is running around in Silicon Valley enough, right? Is why are we building the thing we're building?
Amen.
Right? So, hi, Brian.
All right, I'll try to be quick because I know we're approaching the end. So I just I appreciated what you said. You almost said the banality of good, or maybe you did see that. I just did say that, but I wrote it down in any case. So I don't know if you said it or if I picked it up.
I didn't say it, but that's a great term.
I mean, because that's really what we need, right? I think that social media has largely turned online interactions to banal, evil interactions in a lot of cases. Look at the comm boxes in many places, and you can see these banal, evil interactions happening, and everyone just expects it now. But I think that also gives us the hope with reversing it, right? If we can produce these negative interactions by the way that we set up the technological context, then we should be able to reverse that just as much. And we can see also this happening with, for example, YouTube, where YouTube has polarized people into these extremes because extremism is attractive. It keeps your eyeballs on the system. But if it's able to extremify people, it should be able to bring them back also. The problem is if you start talking to the people in the tech companies about this type of promotion of virtue or good or anything in particular, they'll say, oh, that's not our job, much like Peter Hess just wrote down in the comments there. That's where the rockets go up, who knows where they come down. And so once again, they're forced by legal requirements to maximize shareholder value and externalize a whole bunch of costs on society, which is that, how many billions of dollars in damage have been done by social media on American society and global society for that matter, based on the fact that people don't get along with each other as much anymore. And ultimately it goes through our entire political system. And if the entire country, reaches a very bad situation because of this, it'll be extremely expensive in terms more like trillions of dollars. But if that kind of damage can be done because of the way we set up a technological context, that kind of damage should be reversible. It's probably not as easy. It's probably much more easy to damage something than to make it better. But I think that we can hopefully think really hard about this and come up with better solutions. But we need to get the tech people involved, much like Peter was saying, and much like, you know, many people have been trying to do as far as getting tech companies more interested in the ethical impact of their work.
Well, I know Markle is doing that, and you've had me involved in a few of those things, but yeah. But I also think there's a broader cultural. I do think there is this vicious cycle that exists, but it exists within the context of a broader culture that I think Francis really does do a good job of sort of hitting the nail on the head here by saying, you know, we end up in these banal, evil, vicious cycles because of the nature of the way we understand technology today in the first place. And so we have to sort of get underneath that first and rethink what technology is for, and do a good job of sort of reframing technology back as this tool and not as this end unto itself. And if we make it an end unto itself, then we're never going to be able to sort of present this, because then the next great, whether it's social media or ChatGPT, or everybody's going to jump on board because it's the next greatest thing, right? Instead of, you know, maybe those 100 million users that ChatGPT got to in a matter of hours, right? Maybe those 100 million users, of which I was one of them, right, should have stopped and said, well, what is this thing actually going to be for, right? And maybe some did. Maybe some got on there, right, and said, this is something that we don't, you know, this is something that I don't really need, right? I tried it. It's not all that interesting. It doesn't seem to actually actually making my life meaningfully better, right? And therefore, I'm going to step away. But that's not the conversation you're having amongst all the media and all that, right? It's all about, like, how do we train our kids to use ChatGPT? How do we make prompt engineers? How do we, you know, that's the future of all work everywhere, because this thing now exists. It's going to take over everything. I think we need a cultural pause, not a technological pause, but I think we need a cultural pause to say, well, what do we actually want from our technology? How we create that, I'm not really sure. I'm you know, maybe I'm just sort of you know, being a little bit, you know, over idealistic here. But I do think we have to get behind that cultural paradigm first, or maybe it's not first. Maybe it is cyclical. Maybe it is, we need to create virtuous cycles that help us to begin to think better about these things. And maybe it is one student at a time and one article at a time and things like that to get people to rethink and changing the cultural norms. But I do think recognizing first it is a cultural problem is one of the most important things we need to do.
Yeah, I'll just say one thing on that. If technology, the purpose of technology is ultimately right now to just give us what we want, right? And if the ultimate end of that is to give everyone exactly what they want, then it becomes extremely important to want the right things. And I think that what you've been saying with Pope Francis and the culture of encounter is something that we should keep in mind. We should be wanting to have these correct sorts of, you know, positive social encounters with each other, and not these sort of destructive encounters, which we really valorize in a certain way, and it's ultimately very corrosive.